A confession. I am a research scientist and a psychology professor who studies race and gender achievement gaps. But at this moment in my career, I'm also a scientist in crisis. As a Black woman who's been in the STEM field, has been doing this research on Black achievement for almost 20 years, I often think, can I continue to do what I'm doing in the way that I do it? Oftentimes, I think about leaving the academy of late and maybe trying something new. Now, lest you all think this is another post-COVID midlife crisis talk, maybe I have something a little different. I love science because it is a powerful tool to systematically understand how the world works, and in psychology, how people think, feel, and act. But I am most drawn to the foundational principles of the scientific method. Take, for instance, if you all think that the world is flat and I think the world is round, then it is my idea to prove myself wrong. That science says that I have to embrace skeptics, that I have to embrace alternative theories. And if after study after study, if after observation after observation, I come to the conclusion that, say, it looks like the world is round, then I get to say that there's the strongest possible evidence that indeed the world is round. For now, until the next group of scientists comes and pokes holes in my idea. This is the principle of falsification, and it is foundational principles like these that help us to understand the richness and complexity of the human condition. Things like what motivates us, what inspires us, why does conflict exist in every country and cultural context the world over? How does discrimination and bias lead to an early grave? Yet, as of late, there's been sort of this idea around the foundation of scientific principles that has become a battleground, the old guard, if you will, versus the youngins and the new generation. The idea that maybe the younger generation are shunning these scientific principles, that they want to embrace the idea that they must be right, and that there's no possible way to be wrong, that they're triggered and angered by skeptics, and that they don't want to really embrace these alternative ideas. Now, my talk is not about the old guard versus the new generation, although maybe I'll make some comments about this later. I want to share a little bit about my life, my career, and the research I do, and how it all comes together to share how incredibly rewarding, yet challenging, and sometimes even painful, when you try to balance the objectivity that science requires with my personal upbringing about race. And in doing so, maybe, just maybe, there's a more universal story out there about how the sciences needs to evolve, or maybe about how all kinds of professions that each of you are in, need to be involved. Now, many of these ideas I really kind of never really thought about until I had to put together a coherent story. So I don't know if this is going to be coherent, but here's mine. I wasn't always a scientist, but science was something that's always been part of my life. I grew up about an hour and 10 minutes away from here in Brentwood, Long Island. I went to Brentwood High School. My family was the first Black family that were homeowners in my neighborhood, and my parents would tell everybody who would listen because they were very proud. My mom was a school teacher. My dad was an engineer. He worked at MacArthur Airport. And for our family, education was everything, full stop. Few examples. My father would think nothing of whipping out a textbook from 1935 from underneath the seat of his car and hand it to the back to my brother and I to do math problems. And we knew it was from 1935 because it actually said that, and the pages were crumbling. And my brother and I would look at each other and we'd go, really? Like, how does he have this textbook? And did he really steal the textbook from his high school? Like, what is going on here? My brother. I think that I just got my love of science from my brother. He's my older brother. His name is Vincent. He's a year and a half older than me. And, back in the 80s, there was only one TV in the house. And he was obsessed with science fiction. Star Trek, Buck Rogers, Battlestar Galactica. And so, when you're the little sister, either you learn to love science or you don't get to watch TV. So we would play chess together. We would play Battleship together. We would build Millennium Falcon models together. And on occasion, on the rare occasion that my parents weren't home, we'd go in the backyard and he would show me how you can create a fire and burn leaves by just taking a magnifying glass, having the sun hit the magnifying glass just at the right moment, and poof, you could light it up. Now, I hope my mom's not watching, and I'm sorry. But I loved him. We had a lot of fun together, and I learned an awful lot about science. Now, my parents never really talked a lot about race, but there was always this sense in our family, and they would sort of bring up stories around this idea that there were whites in our neighborhood that were judging us, that thought that we shouldn't live there, that we were uncouth, that we didn't belong to be in the schools that we were in. And while they never really said it, there was like this sense that this was something that was always something we had to contend with. And this is one of the problems with contending with stereotypes. Whatever stereotype group you belong with, you never actually know. It's not always just about discrimination or not. Sometimes you're wondering, is it you or is it the situation that you find yourself in? Now, back in the day, I thought my parents were absolutely paranoid. And I was like, what whites are they looking at that are looking at us? Because I know the ones next door are drinking and having a great time, and they are not thinking about us. A final story. When I was about 10 years old, it was really hot, just like the past couple of days. And my parents had this rule that we were not allowed to wear jeans or sneakers or shorts to school. We had to be completely dressed up because not only did you have to get A's, but you had to look like an A student, whatever that looks like. And I begged my mom, I said, can I please wear shorts to school? It's so hot, and that was a non-starter. So off to school I went in a thick polyester blouse with a bow, brown pants, and Mary Jane shoes. And I was kind of chubby when I was little. It's like it's clinging to me. My chubby stomach's like hanging over the pants. And my little 10-year-old self is saying, what does this have to do with getting an A? Now, lest you all think my parents were lunatics, maybe they were. Many of you are laughing and nodding because you have stories like these because you know what time it is. That my parents were teaching us the code of survival at the time. This idea that there are people, maybe it's not your neighbors, but they're going to be judging you because of your skin color. And they're going to think that you're not smart and you're not good enough and you better be ready. Millennium Falcon, 1935 math textbook, and all. So I hope that I did my parents proud. I went to Columbia College, right up the street and here. Yes, thank you. Graduated from Columbia College, lettered in varsity basketball. I majored in psychology, and after working for a few years, I started my PhD at Stanford University, and I started to work on what I now know is one of the greatest psychologists of our time, Claude Steele. He was and is one of the world's leading experts on understanding and closing what were called at the time racial achievement gaps. They're called racial opportunity gaps now, and a lot of it's because of the work that we did. And the fact that I had in him a Black mentor, that was super cool. And he listened to jazz quite a bit, was a bonus. It was in his lab that I first learned about the science and the formalized ideas around the toll that worrying and contending with stereotypes played. And what we talked about was this idea that when you see, say, two groups of students, and in this example, there's lots of different examples, but in this example, you have Black students, you have white students, they're taking a very difficult standardized math test, and what emerges is a gap where white students are performing better than Black students. That one plausible explanation for this gap is the classroom environment. That for Black students, they're contending with the burden, the societal stereotypes that are out there that say that Blacks may be genetically inferior or come from neighborhoods and cultures of poverty that don't value education. And this is an awareness that's really sort of can operate oftentimes at the unconscious level, the messages that we get. And contending with these stereotypes can be stressful, and when the stress is sufficiently robust, it can disrupt cognition and undermine performance. This phenomenon is called stereotype threat. And we learned to use the most rigorous scientific methods to show that stereotype threat, this psychological predicament that faces Black students, but faces all of us of many different groups, can actually be a more plausible explanation for underperformance than other kinds of explanations out there, such that Blacks and women are genetically inferior or that we come from neighborhoods that don't value education. Now, inside Claude's lab, ironically enough, I really never thought about my childhood and sort of thinking about race and my parents. The work resonated, and I was good at it. But outside, doubts about my ability were everywhere. I was one of the few Black students that were getting their PhD in the country at the time. It was early 2000s. And there was constantly this, who's gonna drop out next? Who's gonna drop out next? And when you're in an environment like that, I started to hear the echoes of my parents. And I said to myself, I'm not just gonna learn science, I'm gonna be science, and I'm gonna look science. I was in California. I traded my heels for Birkenstocks. I wore brown. I would study in the engineering library because this just feels kind of sciencey. I'm gonna hang out here. I read the New Yorker cover to cover every day. I carried it around with me so everybody could see it. I devoured philosophy like Kierkegaard. I read Philip Roth cover to cover. I read Frederick Douglass cover to cover. And looking back, I don't know why I was reading those books. This kind of, in a way, it was great, didn't really have anything to do with my PhD, but I really felt like I had to absorb this idea of smartness. So I hope you see the irony here, that here I am worrying about smartness and other people judging me while becoming an expert on the toll that it plays to worry about contending with stereotypes. And as it turns out, contending with stereotypes can have an enormous toll on your physiological and psychological system. It can increase blood pressure, it can undermine sleep, it could lead to poor decision-making, it can undermine motivation, and over time, it can lead people to literally change their careers because of the stress and the toll. But I was inspired because I knew that there were ways to mitigate these effects, and I said, this is what I want to spend my life working on. And up to now, this is what I've been working on. So I graduated from Stanford. My first job was at Yale University in the Department of Psychology. I started my own research lab, and I also joined a team, a group of psychologists. We were all trained by Claude Steele. My buddy Jeffrey Cohen, David Sherman, Julio Garcia, may he rest in peace, later on Jonathan Cook. And now we started to work on another problem, the problem of how do you eradicate these stereotypes psychologically and boost Black students' performance. Now, we all know that the real idea out here is we have to change structures. But what we psychologists know that in the meantime, you have to give people a kind of armor, if you will, to cope. And so the armor that we were thinking about and started developing was this idea of self-affirmation. And so we designed and tested self-affirmation interventions. These interventions are very simple. 15-minute writing exercises on a piece of paper. You could do it on your phone, you could do it on Instagram, whatever, but it has to be private. Very short writing exercises that prompt students to write about their personal, deepest core values. Values like friends, family, relationships, music, art, religion, sense of humor. What is it that you stand for? What is it that makes you you? What matters most more than anything? And students would write these little short exercises. There's a lot of science behind it that I'm skipping, but as it turns out, we were able to show that these 15-minute writing exercises were able to lift Black and Latinx students' test performance, oftentimes a whole letter grade from a C to a B. It increased students' openness to learning, and it even improved health outcomes. We worked in middle schools, high schools, colleges around the country, and we were also able to show that these effects lasted sometimes years and years after students would leave school, literally sending them on a different trajectory. And all the while, we were doing this with the most rigorous of methods, which are randomized controlled trials. And we even adopted the language of the medical profession, the idea of using the language of clinical trials, because we wanted to just really drive home the rigor of the research. By 2012, the Obama administration had heard about our research, and they had invited us to a White House conference on education, where Jeff Cohen, our team, presented the research. The one caveat is that it wasn't actually at the White House. It was in a White House down the street from the White House. But I'll take it. White House conference on education. It was one of the greatest moments of my career. All the while, I felt like I was drowning with no life raft. in sight. And I now know, looking back, I was struggling with depression. And the real problem is not so much being the only X or only Y, being the only Black woman here, being the only Black scientist there. That's not really the problem. The problem is, in order to really own this kind of science, you have to engage with people seriously and be value neutral, people who really believe and look at you and say, your group isn't smart. Your group shouldn't really be here. And they have science to show that. Sometimes they were geneticists, sometimes they were economists, sometimes they were other psychologists, sometimes they were people from test-taking companies. And all the while, I had to be neutral and objective because that's what the science also requires to really engage this. But psychologically, it starts to really wear you down. The other thing that was really unique to me is that oftentimes, all of these thousands of hours of research would actually be boiled down to me. And people would say, well, you made it, and you're Black, so surely everybody else can make it. Not knowing, number one, how incredibly offensive and hurtful that is. Number two, how it's completely antithetical to the science. And number three, the toll that that takes on a person like me. By this time, I was a junior faculty member at Columbia. I was still working incredibly hard. I still wore brown. My marriage crumbled, and I let my friendships wane. And all the while, I was fine. And I was fine because there's another ethos that's out there in science. And this is this unspoken idea that in order to really do science well, you have to suffer. You got to be a little strange. You got to be a little quirky. But if your personal life is falling apart, if your marriage is crumbling, it's kind of okay because it's a small price to pay for the incredible discoveries that we get to make. And so I was fine until I wasn't. So what was the moment that I knew things had to change? It was my first Mother's Day as a divorced single mom. My kid at the time, my daughter, was 7 years old. She's now 15. I now have a more expanded family with a 25-year-old and a 33-year-old. But at that time, it was just she and I, and we rolled together. And she handed me this very, very, very long list of all the things that she thought that she and I were going to do on Mother's Day. We were going to get our nails done, and then we were going to make hamburgers. Then we were going to go back and get our toes done, and then we were going to ride bikes. And then maybe we'd go get makeup together. Because for all of you mothers out there, we all know that everyone thinks that Mother's Day is about what your kids think that you ought to be doing instead of what you actually want to be doing, which is not talking to them. But that is another TED Talk. I couldn't get out of bed. I was depressed. And the irony is the week before, it was just announced that I had achieved tenure at Columbia University, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And I felt like a failure. It was in that moment that my view of science changed. Or in looking back, I think that my view of science and my perspective on science expanded. And I stopped worrying about this idea of smartness and who out there was judging me and how I was going to respond to them, this kind of war that was going on with myself and society. And I started thinking about, what are our interventions really about? Our interventions are really about thousands of people out there, people like you, sharing with us their deepest values. We had stacks of papers, and then later on in our computers, all of your stories about your friends, your family, the art that you love, the music that you listen to, the religion that you hold so dearly to. And what I now know is that these interventions work because when things seem really, really overwhelmingly large, you're waiting for a medical diagnosis and you don't know how it's going to go. You're practicing for a talk and it's kind of stressful. You're taking a standardized exam to try to get into a school. You just came here from a new country and you're trying to find your way. That what we know is that these kinds of things, which are really, really stressful, can be shrunk down to their appropriate psychological size when they stand in your mind side by side with your values, what you believe in, what you stand for. Once I started thinking about my own values, I changed. I didn't change overnight, but I changed. And I started to breathe life into my values. And I started to really think about what is it that matters most to me, my friends, my family, my hobbies. And then I needed to not just make time for them, but breathe life to them everywhere I am. And that period of my life led to the person that you see in front of you today. The person that still wears brown, but just brown shoes. The person that's able to be a little quirky, that doesn't mind being a little vulnerable. Because I want to share with you the richness and complexity of what it really means to be a scientist. There are Edisons out there, there are Oppenheimers out there, but there's also me. And so I want to close by asking two thought questions. First, for those of you out there who are leaders in your industry, or you're one of the older established people, I always think about my time and my struggles, and I think about this idea that I was looking through the lens of a telescope at the wrong end, the lens that makes things very narrow and small. And if you are one of those people that's bemoaning the new generation, and they are sort of shunning the principles that you hold so near and dear to you, I ask you to look at them differently, because maybe they are trying to create the kind of inclusive environment and sense of belonging that eluded us, and that they see what we actually went through, and they say, we want to be something different. So I ask you, what lens of the telescope are you looking at? And finally, for those of you who may be at a crossroads in your career, maybe you're one of the first X or Y, and you're wondering if you too can go on, I ask you, what have you sacrificed? What are the lessons that you've learned in your pursuit of excellence that have made it really challenging for you to go on? And is there a way to expand your own idea of who you are and who you can be in order to continue? What lens of the telescope are you looking through? And do you like what you see? Thank you.